The rain had not stopped in 4 days. It came in low, gray waves across the Lorraine plateau, sweeping down from the distant ridge of the Vosges and turning every unpaved track into a brown river, every plowed field into a shallow lake of brown water and churned clay. The poplar trees lining the Route Nationale were shedding their leaves early, not in the bright colors of a proper autumn, but in a pale, exhausted yellow, as though the trees themselves had grown tired of the war that had torn through their roots since the previous week. It was the 17th of September, 1944, and the men of Combat Command A, 4th Armored Division, 3rd United States Army, were doing what soldiers have done between battles since the beginning of organized warfare. They were eating cold food, writing letters they were not sure would arrive, sleeping in short intervals on the wet ground beside their vehicles, and waiting. Captain James Harwell, commanding officer of Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 37th Armored Regiment, was sitting on the rear deck of his M4A1 Sherman tank and studying a map that the rain had already softened to the consistency of damp cloth. He was 31 years old, a graduate of Virginia Military Institute, class of 36, and he had been in continuous combat since the hedgerow country of Normandy in July. His face showed it, not in any dramatic way, but in the particular quality of stillness that men develop when they have spent enough time in situations where sudden movement can get them killed. He had dark eyes, a broad jaw, and hands permanently blackened with grease and the reddish soil of France. His one-piece tanker's coverall, olive drab, was torn at the left elbow and smelled of diesel exhaust and the particular sharp chemical odor of propellant that never entirely left the interior of a tank that had fired its main gun in anger. The town of Unequal lay 400 meters behind him, a modest assembly of stone farmhouses, a 12th-century church whose steeple had lost its upper third to shell fire at some point in the previous 10 days, and a crossroads that had been, until 6 days ago, held by the Germans and was now marked by 2 burned-out half-tracks pushed to the ditch by American engineers. Before him, to the northeast, the ground opened across a series of low, rolling hills divided by hedgerows, drainage ditches, and the narrow country roads connecting a dozen villages whose names, Rechicourt-la-Petite, Lezay, Quancourt, Moyenvic, were already marked in grease pencil on the acetate overlay of his mapboard. His tank, which the crew called Lucky Madeleine after the girl in the Bemelmans picture books, was hauled down behind a low earthen bank at the crest of a gentle ridge. From this position, Harwell could see perhaps 2 kilometers to the northeast on a clear day. Today was not a clear day. The fog that had settled into the valley of the Meurthe River overnight was the dense, almost physical fog of river country in early autumn, the kind that reduces the world to a white circle 30 meters in diameter and turns every sound strange, muffling some noises entirely while carrying others with uncanny clarity across distances that should have swallowed them. Sergeant First Class Eldon Pruitt dropped down from the turret and accepted a cigarette from the pack Harwell held out without being asked. Pruitt was from Hazard, Kentucky, 26 years old, broad through the shoulders, a man of exceptional economy in both speech and movement. He had been with Charlie Company since the training grounds of England and had, in Harwell's considered professional judgment, the finest instincts for ground of any enlisted man in the battalion. He looked northeast into the fog for a long moment before he spoke. S2 called it in about an hour ago, Pruitt said. Engine noise. A lot of it.
Coming from somewhere past Coincourt. Harwell folded his map along a crease and looked at the terrain overlay. The 4th Armored Division held what their own divisional commander, Major General John S. Wood, would have described in private, and with considerable profanity, as a dangerously extended position. Combat Command A held Unequal and the surrounding villages. Combat Command B was positioned to the south. Between these formations, the lines were thin, the gaps real, and the supply situation, after the extraordinary 6-week race across France from the Seine to the Moselle, had reduced fuel and ammunition reserves to levels that Harwell found uncomfortable to contemplate for more than a few seconds at a time. Patton's Third Army had outrun its logistics. Every officer in the army knew it. The question that no one spoke aloud
was whether the Germans knew it too. They did. What Harwell could not yet know, because it existed only in encrypted German radio traffic passing between Hitler's headquarters at Rastenburg in East Prussia and the command post of the newly activated Fifth Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel, was the outline of a major counteroffensive aimed directly at the Ehrencourt salient. The Führer had ordered it personally. The plan called for 3 panzer brigades, the 111th, the 113th, and elements of the 112th, each equipped with the Panzer V Ausführung G, the Panther, to strike southwest, cut through Patton's exposed flank, and restore the German line in Lorraine before the Americans could consolidate their position. On paper, it was a formidable force. The Panther was by almost any technical standard the finest medium tank in the world in September of 1944. Its main armament, the 75mm KWK-42, with a barrel length of 70 calibers, could penetrate the frontal armor of any American tank at ranges beyond 1,000 meters. Its own frontal hull armor, 80 millimeters of face-hardened steel sloped at 55 degrees from vertical, was effectively impenetrable to the standard 75mm gun carried by the majority of American Shermans at any tactically realistic combat range. In a straight fight at long range on open ground, the Panther held every advantage. Harwell knew all of this. He had read the intelligence summaries. He had seen the penetration tables. He had, in the Bocage country of Normandy, watched a Panther round pass through the frontal armor of a Sherman at 800 meters as though the armor were tin. He did not need to be reminded of what he was up against. What he believed, what he had constructed from 14 months of continuous combat into something approaching professional faith, was that the Panther's technical superiority was not the whole of the equation. Terrain mattered. Training mattered. And above all, communication mattered. Every Sherman and Charlie Company carried an SCR 510 radio set, a frequency-modulated transceiver operating in the 27 to 39 megacycle band, with a range in normal conditions of approximately 5 kilometers between vehicle-mounted sets and somewhat less between a vehicle set and a portable infantry radio. The SCR 510 was not a perfect piece of equipment. It was subject to atmospheric interference in river valleys. Its crystals required periodic replacement, and its controls demanded a degree of familiarity that took weeks to develop properly. But it worked. It worked reliably enough that at any given moment during a tactical engagement, Harwell could speak to every vehicle commander in his company, to his adjacent unit commanders, to his battalion commander, and to his artillery forward observer, all within seconds and without leaving his turret. He could coordinate the fires of 17 tanks across a frontage of 2 kilometers as fluidly as a conductor moves an orchestra through a familiar score. The German panzer brigades assembling in the fog to his northeast had no equivalent capability. Their radio equipment was adequate at the battalion level and above. At the company level and below, German armored units in September of 1944 were fighting with communication systems that were, in practical terms, considerably inferior to what their American opponents used routinely. Coordination between individual vehicles in a German panzer company in the confusion of close terrain depended heavily on hand signals, flag signals, and the physical proximity of commanders. Methods that worked adequately in open country but broke down rapidly in the hedgerows, drainage ditches, and fog-shrouded farm tracks of Lorraine. Harwell put his cigarette out against the wet steel of the hull and reached for his radio handset. "All Charlie elements, this is Charlie 6, he said, his voice level and unhurried. "I want radio check and ammunition state from all platoon leaders. Report in sequence. Charlie 6 standing by." The radio hissed with the atmospheric static of the river valley. Then, one by one, his platoon leaders checked in. Their voices carried the flat, professional calm of men who have learned to keep fear out of their vocal cords because the man listening needs information, not emotion. To the northeast, barely audible beneath the static and the rain, the sound of engines continued to grow. The fog came alive at 0647. That was the time written in the radio log that Private First Class Marcus Webb kept with the obsessive precision of a man who understood that someone, someday, would want to know exactly when things went wrong or right. Webb was 22 years old, from Birmingham, Alabama, small and dark-haired, with the quick, careful hands of someone who had grown up taking apart radios in his father's repair shop on 4th Avenue North. He had joined the Army because the Army had asked him to, and he had ended up as a tank radio operator because a sergeant at Fort Knox had watched him rebuild a field telephone in 11 minutes and made a decision on the spot. Webb loved his SCR 510 the way other men loved their rifles. Personally, attentively, with the knowledge that its health was directly connected to his own. At 0647, Lieutenant Raymond Solis came over the radio. His voice was controlled. That was the first thing Harwell noticed. Not what Solis said, but the quality of his voice, which carried beneath its professional flatness the particular compressed tension of a man looking at something very large and very close and choosing, deliberately, not to let that fact change the way he breathed. Charlie 6, this is Charlie 1-6. I have enemy armor on my front. Bearing 045. Range I estimate 200 meters, maybe less. Moving slow. I count... A pause of 3 seconds that felt considerably longer. I count at least 6 vehicles. Long guns. They look like 5s. Over? 5s. Panthers. Harwell was already moving before Solis finished. He pulled himself through the commander's hatch and stood upright in the turret, fog cold and wet against his face, and swept his binoculars northeast in a long arc. He saw nothing. The fog was absolute, a white wall beginning at 30 meters and ending at infinity. But he could hear them now, and hearing them was enough to understand that Solis's count of 6 was probably conservative. The sound was the deep, layered rumble of multiple Maybach HL-230 engines, each producing 700 horsepower, moving at low speed across wet ground. A sound like distant thunder that did not fade, that grew instead, with the slow, certain patience of something that does not need to hurry because it is very large and you are in its way. Charlie 1-6, this is Charlie 6. Hold your position. Engage at your discretion. Use the hedgerow. Do not show them your front. Acknowledge. Charlie 1-6, Wilco. Harwell dropped back into the turret and turned to his gunner. Corporal Anthony Fierro of Providence, Rhode Island, was 23 years old, slight, with the dark eyes and precise movements of a man whose entire relationship with the world was mediated through careful observation. Fierro had grown up watching his uncle, a watchmaker on Atwell's Avenue, take apart and reassemble mechanisms of extraordinary complexity, with instruments that seemed absurdly delicate for the purpose. Something of that patience had transferred. Fierro was the finest gunner Harwell had ever commanded, and Harwell had never told him so directly, because in his experience, telling a man he was exceptional sometimes made him cautious in ways that cost fractions of seconds he could not afford to lose. Tony, Panther, side armor, what do you need? Fierro did not look up from his sight. Under 400 meters, sir. Our 76 will go through their side at that range clean. Front armor, I won't promise you anything below 800, and even then it depends on the angle. He paused. We want their ears, not their face. That's right. Harwell put his eye to his periscope and swept the ground ahead. Load AP. Keep a round of HE on the ready rack, but lead with AP every time. Already done, Captain. What happened in the next 6 minutes at Lieutenant Solis's position was the kind of small unit action that does not make newspaper headlines because it is too compressed, too local, too dependent on details of terrain and timing that resist the simplifications of journalism. But it was, in its way, a perfect expression of everything that made the 4th Armored Division dangerous in close country. Solis had positioned his 3 Shermans overnight in an L-shaped arrangement along a farm track running northeast from the village of Leze toward the hamlet of Coincourt. His own tank and Sergeant Walsh's tank were hull down behind a hedgerow running east to west.
their guns oriented northeast along the track. Sergeant Kopp's tank occupied the corner of the L, positioned to cover the drainage ditch running alongside the track from the north. It was not a complex arrangement. Complexity was not what the situation required. What it required was patience, the willingness to hold position in the cold and the fog and the silence and wait, without moving, without speaking on the radio, without doing anything at all that might reveal the position before the moment was right. The Panthers came in column, single file, down the track, the lead vehicle moving at perhaps 8 kilometers per hour with its long 75mm gun traversed slightly left. The column spacing was too close, vehicles barely 40 meters apart, which meant that when the lead vehicle stopped, the second had almost no room to maneuver. This was the error of inexperience, the error of crews who had trained intensively on their vehicle's mechanical operation but had not yet internalized the spatial geometry of armored movement in restricted terrain. The 113th Panzer Brigade had been formed 6 weeks earlier, its crews drawn partly from Luftwaffe ground units and Panzer Grenadier formations, men given excellent machines and inadequate time to learn the full art of fighting them. The lead Panther emerged from the fog at approximately 170 meters from Walsh's position. Its commander was standing in the open hatch with binoculars raised, scanning the hedgerow ahead. He was doing exactly what a careful commander should do. He was simply doing it too late, in terrain he did not know, against men who had been waiting for him for 3 hours. Walsh's gunner fired first. The muzzle blast was a flat, hard crack that the fog seemed to absorb and redirect in every direction simultaneously. The armor-piercing round, a 76mm M79 AP shot weighing nearly 7 kilograms, crossed 160 meters in less time than it takes to blink, and struck the lead Panther on its left hull side, in the upper section where 45mm of vertical steel plate offered nothing adequate to stop it. The round went through clean. What happened inside the Panther in the following 2 seconds involved physics and chemistry that no one who survived it was in a position to describe in detail. The turret lifted on a column of orange fire and settled back at an angle. Black smoke poured from every opening. The second Panther had no time. Solis's gunner put a round into its right track assembly, tearing the track free of its upper run and spinning the vehicle sideways across the road with the helpless inertia of a machine that suddenly cannot go where it intends. A follow-up round through the engine deck ended the question of whether it might still be dangerous. The third and fourth Panthers attempted to reverse. In the fog, on the narrow track, with 2 burning hulks blocking the road ahead, reversing was not a maneuver that could be accomplished with any speed. Sergeant Kopp's tank, waiting at the corner of his L, had been watching for exactly this. He fired 3 times in 11 seconds. 2 rounds connected. One Panther burned immediately, the ammunition in its turret bustle cooking off in a series of secondary explosions that sent the hatch covers spinning into the fog. The second Panther lurched sideways into the drainage ditch at a steep angle, its engine still running, its gun buried in the soft ground, its crew coming out of the hatches and running east without looking back. The 5th and 6th Panthers, further back in the column, managed to reverse into the fog before Kopp could engage them again. They disappeared into the white as completely as if they had never existed. 4 Panthers destroyed or disabled, 4 crews, or what remained of them. American losses, 0 vehicles, 0 men. Harwell heard the entire engagement over the radio, the brief, precise transmissions of Solis and his commanders, the sound of the gun reports carried faintly through the open squelch, the clipped acknowledgments of men working together in the dark with total confidence in the system that connected them. He was moving before the last transmission ended, guiding Lucky Madeline northeast along the ridge with his remaining 2 platoons spread in a loose line behind him, keeping the hedge lines between his vehicles and the open ground to the northeast, where the fog was beginning, very slowly, to show its first pale thinning at the upper edges. The fog would not last. He knew this with the certainty of a man who has spent enough mornings in River Valley country to read the quality of light above the mist. 2 hours, perhaps 3. When it went,
The geometry of the battle would change entirely, and not in his favor. Every advantage that the close fog gave him, the neutralization of Panther range, the confusion of enemy commanders who could not see the ground they were crossing, the ability to engage at distances where his guns were adequate, would evaporate with the morning moisture. He needed to use the time. He thought about Emmett Reeves, Walsh's driver, who played harmonica badly and enthusiastically at every rest stop since England, and who was, at this moment, presumably alive inside his tank at the northern end of Solis's position. He thought about the men in the burning Panthers, young men most of them, following orders, dying in fire inside machines that had cost their country enormous resources to build and that had lasted, in the event, approximately 4 minutes of contact with an enemy who had been ready for them. He permitted himself these thoughts for the time it took Lucky Madeline to cover 100 meters of muddy track. Then he set them aside and keyed his radio. "All Charlie elements, this is Charlie 6. Push northeast. Stay on your planned routes. Keep talking to me. We're going to find out what else is out there before this fog decides to leave us. Charlie 6, out." The engines of 11 Shermans answered him in the language of machines, the rising pitch of transmissions engaging, the chunking bite of steel tracks into wet French earth, the steady mechanical breathing of 30-cylinder radial engines turning over in the gray morning air of Lorraine. They drove into the white. September 19th, 0900 hours. The fog began lifting at 0830, not cleanly, but in patches, revealing a farmhouse wall here, a section of road there, before closing again, then opening further. By 9 o'clock, visibility across the plateau reached perhaps 400 meters in some directions, and half that in others, where low ground still held the moisture in dense white pools. It was the worst possible condition for American armor. Not obscured enough to neutralize the Panthers' range advantage, not clear enough to bring air support in with any confidence. Harwell had used the fog well. In the 90 minutes since first contact, Charlie Company had destroyed or disabled 11 Panthers from the 113th Panzer Brigade at ranges between 80 and 300 meters. The tactic was always the same: find the covered approach, wait, shoot the side, move before the return fire arrived, shoot and scoot. The Sherman's gyro-stabilized gun allowed Fierro to lay his sight on target faster than most German gunners could complete their traverse in unfamiliar terrain. Speed of the first shot was everything at close range. The second shot usually went to a vehicle that was already burning. The cost had been 2 Shermans. Both losses came from the same source: an Eastern Front veteran named Fisher, an Oberleutnant of 23 who, unlike most of his brigade, actually understood his trade. Fisher had found a shallow ravine that Harwell's map showed as a dry streambed and used it to work 2 Panthers around 1st Platoon's left flank. He emerged at 220 meters from Walsh's tank and Corporal Henthorn's tank and fired before either American crew completed their traverse. Walsh's Sherman burned immediately. Henthorn's lost its left track and was abandoned, the crew exiting under fire into the drainage ditch. 3 of Walsh's men got out. Private Emmett Reeves of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, who had played harmonica badly and joyfully at every rest stop since England, did not. Harwell heard the report from Solis over the radio. He said nothing for a moment. 4 seconds. 5. And then said, "Understood. Pull your remaining vehicles back to the reverse slope of Hill 284. Charlie 6 out." He sat with the handset in his hand and thought about Reeves for the time it took Lucky Madeline to travel 80 meters of muddy track. Then he set the thought aside with the deliberate precision of a surgeon setting down a used instrument and looked northeast at the thinning fog. This is what the histories do not capture adequately. Not the heroism, which was real, but the arithmetic. The continuous emotional calculation that combat commanders perform, registering each loss at some level below conscious thought, and then setting it aside, not because it does not matter, but because it matters so much that allowing it into the foreground will get more men killed. Harwell had learned this in Normandy.
He had not yet decided whether a man could learn it without cost or whether the cost was only deferred. He keyed his radio. All Charlie elements, consolidate on my position. Platoon leaders give me ammunition and fuel count in 5 minutes. Artillery forward observer, I need you on my net now. Charlie 6, out. Second Lieutenant George Alderman arrived beside Lucky Madeline 2 minutes later in his Jeep, mapboard under one arm, SCR 610 radio handset already raised. Alderman was 22 years old, from the 539th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, and possessed the calm professional manner of a young man who has spent enough time near exploding things to have stopped being surprised by them. He could put 105mm shells into a 200-meter circle at 11,000 meters range. In the economy of armored warfare, this made him worth considerably more than his modest rank suggested. "Lieutenant," Harwell said, spreading his map on the hull, "I need 4 concentration points registered along this ridgeline. Here, 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 and here." Alderman studied the map. "I have 2 of those from last night, sir. I can add the other 2 in 12 minutes. 10. Yes, sir." The platoon leader's reports came in while Alderman worked his radio. The news was not catastrophic, but it was not comfortable. Charlie Company had begun the morning with 17 operational Shermans. It now had 14, with 1 additional vehicle potentially recoverable if they held the ground long enough for the maintenance section to reach it. First platoon was down to 30 rounds of armor piercing per vehicle. The company as a whole had expended roughly a third of its basic load in under 3 hours. Then the fog went. It did not thin gradually any further. It simply left, as Lorraine fog sometimes does, in the space of 20 minutes, retreating into the river valley below, leaving the plateau exposed under a pale September sky with high thin cloud and a watery sun that provided light without warmth. Visibility across the open ground was suddenly 4 kilometers or more, and with that visibility came everything Harwell had been working to prevent. The first long-range round came from the northeast without warning. A flat crack from a tree line 1,100 meters away, a brief muzzle flash, and then the impact against the front slope of Pruitt's tank, a long gouge in the upper glacis plate where the round had struck at a slight angle and deflected upward without penetrating. 8 seconds later, a second round came lower. This one went through the bow machine gun mount, killed Private First Class Dennis Wachowski of Milwaukee instantly, and buried itself in the transmission housing. Pruitt came out of the hatches with blood on his face and fury in his eyes, and climbed directly into Harwell's turret through the nearest open hatch. 1,100 meters, Pruitt said. "We can't touch them from here." "I know." Harwell was already reaching for his handset. "Alderman." The forward observer was at the tank's side in seconds. "I see them, sir. Already talking to the FDC." "How long?" 2 minutes. The Panthers in the tree line fired with methodical patience for 1 minute and 40 seconds. 2 more American tanks were hit. 1 burned, 1 lost its gun to a direct hit on the mantlet and was withdrawn under smoke. The remaining Shermans fired back, not to penetrate, but to break the German gunners' rhythm, to force heads into hatches, to interrupt the calm, deliberate process of aimed fire at long range. Then Alderman said quietly, "Shot out." 14 seconds later, the first battery of 105mm shells walked through the tree line from east to west. The trees channeled and reflected the blast in ways that open ground never does. 2 Panthers had their optics damaged. 1 commander was wounded through his open hatch by a fragment. The rhythm of German fire broke. Panthers began to move. Moving Panthers cannot aim. "Repeat the mission," Harwell said. "Walk it west 50 meters." He was already guiding his remaining platoons into a shallow reentrant, a natural fold in the ground running northeast that his map had shown and the ground now confirmed. 600 meters along it, and he would emerge on the flank of those Panthers at 400 meters range. At 400 meters against Panther side armor, his 76mm was entirely adequate. He thought of Wachowski. He set the thought aside. "Follow me," he said into the radio. "We're going to shoot them in the ear." September 19th, 1100 hours.
The reentrant was 4 meters deep and 12 meters wide, carved over centuries by rainwater draining toward the Meurthe. Its banks were overgrown with coarse grass and stunted willow, its bottom soft but not dangerously so. Kowalski drove Lucky Madeline along it at a speed that balanced momentum against the risk of throwing a track on the uneven ground, and behind him, 11 Shermans followed in single file with the disciplined spacing of crews who understood that closing up in a narrow channel meant that one lucky artillery round could end the entire enterprise at once. Harwell navigated by map and compass, counting meters in his head. The reentrant curved slightly right at 300 meters. His map had not shown this clearly, a reminder that maps represent the ground as it was surveyed, not as it is, and that agricultural country changes its details with every season's drainage work. He adjusted his estimate of the emergence point and tapped Kowalski's shoulder with a corrected bearing.
Pruitt, riding beside him in the turret with a field dressing taped over his eyebrow, said nothing. He had his Thompson submachine gun across his knees and his eyes forward. The Panthers had not moved. 2 had repositioned slightly west along the tree line in response to Alderman's artillery. The other 4 remained in their original positions, still firing methodically at the American vehicles on the ridge above, a covering Sherman that Harwell had left there precisely to keep the German gunners focused on something in front of them rather than looking for what was coming around their flank. From the perspective of Hauptmann Brandt, commanding the Panthers in the tree line, the situation appeared to be developing favorably. He had destroyed or disabled several American tanks. His own vehicles were in covered positions. The American artillery was irritating, but had not yet caused a penetrating hit. He was, in his professional judgment, winning this engagement. He had no idea that 12 Shermans were 40 seconds from his left flank. Lucky Madeline came up the bank of the reentrant at an angle, hull rising against the pale sky before the tracks found flat ground and the tank leveled out. Harwell had his binoculars up before the vehicle fully crested. The tree line was 340 meters away. He could see the angular silhouettes of Panther turrets through the bare lower branches, long guns still pointed west, commanders focused entirely on the ridge. "Driver, halt!" The tank stopped. Behind him, the other Shermans came up the bank in a spreading line, each commander independently reading the ground, finding his position, identifying his target. No orders were necessary. This was the product of 14 months of continuous combat. Not bravery exactly, though bravery was present, but the deeper competence of men who have performed the same actions under fire so many times that the actions have become instinct. "Gunner, Panther, tree line, 10 o'clock. 340 meters. Fierro's voice was perfectly steady. "I have it, sir." "Engage." The 76mm fired. The round crossed 340 meters and struck the nearest Panther below the turret ring, in the upper hull side where 45mm of vertical plate stopped nothing adequately at this range. The Panther shuddered, with a visible mechanical convulsion. Yellow flame appeared at the base of its turret and grew. To Harwell's left, 3 Shermans fired within 2 seconds of each other. To his right, 2 more. The tree line erupted. What followed was not a battle. It was a consequence. Panthers with guns oriented west, commanders focused north, had no time to traverse and engage before the American rounds arrived. 2 were destroyed in the first 15 seconds. A third attempted to back out of the tree line to the east and was caught in the open. Kopp's round struck the rear hull and detonated the engine in a flat orange burst. The 4th and 5th Panthers began their turret traverse too late. One took Fierro's second round through the mantlet. The other was hit simultaneously by 2 different Shermans, which settled any remaining question. The 6th Panther reversed into the trees and disappeared into the country beyond. It was the only one of the 6 to escape. Total time from first round to last, 41 seconds. Hauptmann Brandt did not survive to write his report. Harwell was on the radio before the smoke had settled. He gave Abrams the grid, the count, the ammunition state. Abrams's reply was brief,
which told Harwell the battalion commander had been monitoring the frequency throughout and needed no context. Charlie 6, be advised air is inbound your area. Estimated arrival, 15 minutes. Mark positions with colored smoke when you hear them.
Steel 6, out. Harwell looked up at the pale September sky and felt, for the first time since 0647, something that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it. The P-47 Thunderbolts arrived at 11:22, 4 of them from the 422nd Fighter Squadron, 366 Fighter Group, coming in low from the northwest with the deep, authoritative thunder of Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines, producing 2,500 horsepower each. Harwell pulled his smoke grenade, yanked the pin, and threw it 30 meters south of Lucky Madeline. Orange smoke billowed immediately, spreading in the light wind. Around him, across a frontage of nearly 3 kilometers, orange and yellow plumes began rising from American positions. A flowering of color across the drab plateau that drew a line for the pilots as clearly as any map. The Thunderbolts went to work. They attacked in pairs, making repeated passes from northeast to southwest, putting their 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, the HVAR, which pilots called the Holy Moses, into German armor on the open plateau beyond the tree line. The after-action report from the 422nd would credit the flight with 6 Panthers and 3 half-tracks destroyed in 40 minutes. But the more significant effect was not the vehicles destroyed from the air. It was the change in German behavior. Panthers that had been advancing in the open went to ground. Commanders who had been moving freely between vehicles stayed in their hatches. The methodical, coordinated movement of German armor across the plateau dissolved into isolated, cautious bounds between available cover, each vehicle stopping to watch the sky before continuing. A panther watching the sky is a panther not fighting. When the Thunderbolts departed at 1200 hours, climbing northwest with their external stores expended, the Germans were still present on the plateau in considerable numbers. Fresh elements of the 112th Panzer Brigade had arrived from the northeast and were beginning to probe the northern flank. And Charlie Company's ammunition state had reached a point that Harwell found genuinely alarming. 1st Platoon carried 11 rounds of armor piercing across its 3 operational vehicles. 11 rounds for 3 tanks. Mathematics that did not support continued offensive action. He made his report to Abrams at 12:15. Steel 6, my ammunition state is critical. 1st Platoon is nearly black on AP. Request expedited resupply. If convoy does not arrive by 1500, I will be forced to fight static defensive. Over. A pause of several seconds. Then Abrams, calm as a man discussing the weather. Convoy en route. Estimated arrival 1345. Hold until then. Steel 6, out. 1 hour and 30 minutes. Harwell looked at Pruitt. Pruitt said nothing. He checked the magazine on his Thompson, set it back across his knees, and looked northeast at the ground where the Germans were regrouping in the middle distance, patient and dangerous and not finished. To the northeast, engines. Always engines. September 20th through 22nd, 1944. The ammunition convoy arrived at 1341, 4 minutes early, which Harwell noted with the specific gratitude of a man who has spent 90 minutes calculating exactly how many rounds he has left and exactly how many he needs. The trucks came up the reverse slope of the ridge under intermittent German artillery fire, their drivers keeping their speed and their nerve with the particular courage of men who fight wars in unarmored vehicles and receive considerably less recognition for it than the men in the tanks they supply. Harwell's loaders were pulling crates before the trucks fully stopped. While his crews reloaded, he walked his position. This was something he did whenever time permitted, not pacing, not inspecting, but walking slowly along his line of vehicles, stopping at each one long enough to look at the crew, exchange a few words, read what the faces told him. A commander who knows his men's condition knows his unit's condition, and no radio report conveys what a face conveys. What he saw that afternoon was exhaustion. Deep, genuine exhaustion.
of the kind that accumulates over days rather than hours. But beneath it, something else, something harder and more durable. The men of Charlie Company had destroyed, by the afternoon count, 19 Panthers in less than 8 hours. They knew what they had done. The knowledge sat in them quietly, without celebration, the way genuine competence usually sits in people who possess it. Sergeant Pruitt was supervising the rearrangement of his ready rack when Harwell reached Lucky Madeline. The field dressing on his eyebrow had soaked through and dried to a dark brown. He had not mentioned it or asked for a replacement. "How do you feel?" Harwell asked. Pruitt considered the question with his usual economy. "Ready," he said. Harwell nodded and moved on. The Germans came again at first light on the 20th. This time it was the 111th Panzer Brigade, better trained than the 113th, with a corps of Eastern Front veterans who understood their machines and understood the ground. They came not in column, but in a proper armored formation, vehicles spaced wide, moving in bounds, using every fold of ground the plateau offered, their commanders staying in their hatches and scanning continuously. It was, compared to the previous day's attacks, a professionally executed advance. It was not enough. The radio net that connected Charlie Company to Baker Company on its right, to the artillery of the 539th, to the battalion command post where Abrams monitored every transmission with the focused attention of a man playing chess simultaneously on 3 boards. This net was the weapon that the Panthers could not match with armor or firepower. When the 111th's lead elements pushed southwest toward Rechicourt-la-Petite, Harwell knew about it 14 seconds after Baker Company's forward observer reported it, and Alderman had a fire mission on the approach route before the German formation had covered 300 meters of open ground. When a group of 5 Panthers attempted to use the same re-entrant that Harwell had used the previous day, a logical choice, the best covered approach on the plateau, the American crew that had used it knew exactly where it led and what waited at its end. The 5 Panthers did not emerge. By midday on the 20th, the 111th had lost 14 vehicles and had gained no ground. By evening, it had pulled back to a defensive line along the ridge northeast of Coincourt and was no longer attacking. The 112th Brigade, fresher and approaching from the northeast, made 2 attempts against Combat Command A's northern flank and was repulsed by a combination of tank fire, artillery, and a late afternoon visit from 8 Thunderbolts that arrived with full external stores and left the approach route north of Lizay marked by 7 columns of black smoke visible for 20 kilometers. On the 21st, the German attacks were smaller, more cautious, probing rather than pushing. The initiative had shifted, and everyone on both sides of the line could feel it, the way you can feel a change in air pressure before a storm breaks. The Panzer Brigades had begun the battle expecting to sweep through an overextended American position and restore the German line in Lorraine. Instead, they had lost. By the count that Harwell's Battalion S2 compiled from vehicle inspections and prisoner interrogations in the days following, 86 Panthers destroyed or permanently disabled across the Ericourt sector. The 3 brigades that Hitler had assembled for his Lorraine counteroffensive had been effectively destroyed as offensive formations in 72 hours of fighting. American losses across Combat Command A for the same period: 25 Shermans destroyed, 14 damaged but repairable. Of the destroyed vehicles, the majority had fallen to long-range Panther fire during the open visibility fighting of the 19th's middle hours, the period between the lifting of the fog and the arrival of air support when German range advantage had been fully in play. Charlie Company specifically had lost 5 Shermans destroyed and 2 damaged, 14 men killed, 22 wounded. Harwell wrote the casualty report himself, as he always did, in the field desk in the back of his half-track command vehicle, by the light of a hooded lamp on the evening of the 22nd. He wrote each name in full, rank, full name, home state, and beside each name the circumstances as precisely as he could reconstruct them. It was not required by any regulation that he knew of. He did it because someone should, and because the act of writing a man's name carefully and completely seemed, in some way he could not have articulated to anyone's satisfaction, including his own, to be a minimal but necessary acknowledgement of what that man had given to a field in Lorraine that he had never heard of before the Army sent him there. Private First Class Emmett Reeves, Alabama. Private First Class Dennis Wachowski, Wisconsin. And the others. All the others. When he finished, he folded the report, sealed it in its envelope, and stepped outside into the cold September night. The plateau was quiet. To the northeast, where the panzer brigades had pulled back to their defensive positions, there were no engine sounds, no artillery. Nothing but the wind moving across the harvested fields and the distant barking of a dog in one of the villages that had changed hands twice in the past week and now, for the moment, was still. He stood for a while looking northeast in the dark, at the ground he could not see but could map precisely in his mind. Every ridge, every reentrant, every tree line and drainage ditch across which he had maneuvered his company for 3 days. Somewhere out there in the dark, 86 Panthers were cooling in the Lorraine soil, their armor that had been impenetrable from the front, now open to the sky. Their engines that had rumbled across the plateau with such mechanical certainty, now silent. They had been formidable machines. In a different battle, on different ground, with different opponents, they might have been decisive. But they had come here. Into the fog, into the hedgerows, into the radio net that connected every American tank on the plateau into a single, thinking organism that could see further, react faster, and concentrate its fire more precisely than any number of individually superior vehicles that could not talk to each other. The Panther was the finest medium tank in the world in September of 1944. At Unequal, it had encountered something that technical specifications cannot measure. The accumulated competence of men who had been learning their trade under fire for 14 months, and who had, in the process, developed a way of fighting together that multiplied the effect of every individual vehicle and every individual crew beyond what any of them could have achieved alone. Pruitt appeared beside him, which was not unusual. The sergeant had a quality of quiet presence that Harwell had come to rely on without ever consciously deciding to. "Think they'll try again tomorrow?" Pruitt asked.
Harwell considered it. "No," he said. "Not like this. Not with what they have left." Pruitt nodded, looking northeast at the dark plateau. "Wachowski was from Milwaukee," he said after a moment. "Never been anywhere before the Army. Said Lorraine sounded like a girl's name." "It does," Harwell said. They stood in the quiet for a while. Then Pruitt went back to his tank, and Harwell went back to his half-track, and the night continued over the plateau of Lorraine, cold and still, with the smell of rain coming in again from the Vosges, and the first pale suggestion of dawn beginning, very distantly, to lighten the eastern sky above Germany. The Battle of Unequal was over. The war was not. But they had held.